right. Hello. This is the Queering Games panel, or Bringing Queerness to Gaming. We all know games like Monster Hearts and The Watch that, put LGBTQ front and center in their games. And there's games like Urban Shadows and Cascade that it features very prominently. But sometimes, your crew doesn't want to, have the, kids being awful to each other, or urban politics, or cyberpunk as their focus. So we want to talk about, where you can draw inspiration from and how you can incorporate more queer themes into your games that don't necessarily focus on it. We have Avery Alder of Buried Without Ceremony, and Richard and I, who are members at large at the Gauntlet. And I will just let my guests introduce themselves. Avery, you can go first.
Okay, yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm Avery. I am a game designer. I've been designing games for about 11 years. I think the reason that I'm on this panel today is because some of the things that I've designed are explicitly queer in theme and focus. Monster Hearts, a game about queer teenagers, a game about monstrous teenagers who are often queer and definitely have to contend with queer feelings at least some of the time. As well as games like A Place to Fuck Each Other, which is a game about dykes trying to navigate relationships in a world that doesn't quite make room for them, as well as Dream Askew, which is a post-apocalyptic queer community drama game. So yeah, that's a bit about what I've designed. And I've spoken a few times about topics about how to make games queer, how to make games that are mechanically queer and things like that. And from a more personal level, I'll just mention that I'm a queer trans woman, and I'm navigating being a mom and in polyamorous relationship networks. And so that's a little bit about my personal context as far as why this matters to me personally.
All right, Richard?
All right, I'm Richard Ruane. I am an instructional designer or e-learning designer living in Brooklyn, New York. I am. I did work many moons ago for White Wolf Game Studio back before I was supposed to be born. Then did a little bit of work for Young Bottoms in Love, the queer romance anthology series on Pop Image, and more recently did some scenario design for Organized Play at the 20-sided store in Brooklyn. And that's a store I recommend you stop by if you're ever in Brooklyn.
All right, and I'm River. I am returning to the role-playing hobby after a very long hiatus. I had a gaming group fall apart due to just schedules and adulting things, but I came back to the Gauntlet, and that wonderful community came back to games that focused on queerness, like Monster Hearts, and I found a space that I could really expand into. I am... for some of the people that might be watching this who know me from Meat Space, or the physical world, as some people call it, I am a non-binary person who is exploring what gender and sexuality mean. I'm very, very new to any sort of queerness, and so what brought me here was I said to Rich and Kate, I want to have a panel that explores these topics, and they said, all right, you're running it. And I go, oh dear. And so Kate reached out to Avery, and I reached out to Richard, and we have the panel that you see before you. So that is our introduction. We are going to talk about introducing queer themes to the table. We're going to try to dispel the myth that LGBTQ plus themes are not all ages. They are. They absolutely are. We're going to talk a little bit about bringing queer design into games, and then we're going to go to Q&A. We're going to try to leave as much time as possible for that. So, introducing queer themes at the table. How do the two of you facilitate people playing queer characters? I will go say, Richard, do you want to hit this off?
I actually have only recently had kind of a local game group that felt very comfortable kind of bringing characters with a fully complex lives into our games. So it's largely been an issue of So repeat the question. I'm sorry, River. I started to go off on a tangent there. And
And it's all right. You can always say, "Oh,
Yeah.
wait, I'll answer that after Avery," or
Oh,
Avery,
okay.
if you need a moment to think, I'll bump to Richard. It's how do you facilitate people playing queer characters in your games, whether you're a GM or a player?
Right. I think as a GM, in kind of our local kind of gaming community, it's been a lot about creating space for people to acknowledge their sex lives, their romance lives, their gender identities in the gaming space, which involves asking a lot more questions about their characters and listening to what their answers are, than trying not to make assumptions about people's identity, about people's sexuality, about people's romantic lives, and letting people really sort of bring their stories to life at the table, and then encouraging them to really bring in the people who are in their lives as sort of player-driven, for lack of a better word, player-driven NPCs, so that you get to meet their partner, you get to meet their local community of people that they're close to, you get to meet sort of their families and families of choice, and you really get to a chance to sort of discuss and bring those people into the drama and action of the game. So I think in a general sense, it's really getting a chance to let players sort of articulate their character's story outside the immediate moment of action, and have definitely had some issues in doing that it as a player, where it's also about letting those stories get equal time with straight people doing the same thing, or straight player characters doing the same thing. And so it's a matter of giving those stories kind of the equal time and equal access to the drama or action of the game. So,
all right, Avery, what would you like to add to that?
Yeah. Well, I guess first, a thing that I believe is true is that role-playing games are a really great place to get it wrong. It's a really low-stakes environment. It's not something you have to carry with you outside of the game into the rest of your life as much as you would, if these were interactions you were having, or bumbling mistakes you were making in the workroom, for example, or something like that. And so I think reminding people of that context, that this is a lower barrier, lower risk place to do exploring and learning and making mistakes and accepting critique and gentle guidance and kind of adapting and growing in that way. So as far as how I facilitate it, kind of putting that reminder on the table explicitly for people is part of it. I think there's a great piece of writing advice that I came across the other day, and I've come across a few times, and I don't know, I think it might come from Writing the Other, which is a really good book, or it might be just similar to it, but the piece of writing is basically if you're a straight person, include gay characters in your stories, but don't write stories about being gay. If you're a white person, include people of color in your stories, but don't write stories about the experience of being a person of color. And it goes on like that. If you're able-bodied, include disabled characters, but don't write stories about what it is like to experience and live through disability. And I think that is a really great starting point for games, that everyone should be looking at the settings that they're crafting, the milieu that they're building, and the characters that they are game to game choosing to introduce, and kind of challenging themselves, I guess, to be and is this character that I'm playing yet another straight character? Is this player that character that I'm playing yet another disabled character? Is this character that I'm playing yet another white person? And in different ways, challenging ourselves to kind of sample from a wider breadth of lived experience.
All right.
And I think with there's a piece of advice text I have in Monster Hearts about how to introduce queer content, which is sometimes when you introduce a queer character, their queerness should be at the heart of who they are and how you understand this character and what this character's involvement in the plot is. And sometimes it should be super incidental, right? The principal of the high school, Mr. Rogers, just happens to have a husband.
And this is a very good segue into the next question that we had planned. So I will let you roll straight into that, Avery, is when you're a GM, when and how do you introduce queer characters? And that's a very good example. Now, I have tried in the past to get my players to talk about what their character's home life is like. What do we see your character doing in the morning before the call comes in, or things like that. And they usually look at me with just horrified blank looks on their faces. Like, do you have kids? Do you have a dog? Do you have a partner? And they're like, I live in a 3rd-story walk-up. And that's about all they get. So yeah, please expand on that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, definitely. That little piece of advice I just gave, I think, is the most relevant one I've got. That as a GM or an MC or whatever your role is, sometimes be introducing characters with specific lived experiences and have those experiences be incidental and have them be the driving core of that character's concept. I think another thing is to play around with the level of expectability that you have with a character. If you're introducing queer characters, some of them can just be like, yeah, this is a butch lesbian who has a motorcycle that she got from her father and souped up herself, because of course she does, because it's the very first thing I think my brain happens to think of when I think of who is this butch lesbian character. So sometimes you can play with those cliches or levels of expectability, and those tropes and those archetypes, and then make sure that you're not falling into the pit of just replicating stereotypes endlessly. Also be looking to have unusual pairings, unexpected differences of character. So yeah, kind of having the slider of for a queer character you're introducing, how much is their queerness a driving force of play, and how much is their queerness pulled from archetypes I see in media, and just play with those sliders, character to character.
Is that something that you put in the notes? This is how much of, this character's sexuality I want to expose, or do you just sort of let it go organically after you introduce them?
I don't know. I think that anytime that you're like an MC or a GM and you're introducing a character, usually you've got one or two kind of core concepts for who that character is right at the outset, because you're like, okay, I need an authority figure to step in to deal with these teens in this moment because of how the dice rolled. So I'll imagine a principal, and I'll imagine that he's really authoritarian because his dad was a military dad, right? So if that's your core, then I guess the way you flesh out the character, have some of it just fall into place because that's the obvious thing that would stem from this character's core concept, and have some of it be unexpected because you're challenging yourself to think outside of your existing archetypes and outside of the box.
All right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. Richard, so when you're going to introduce queer characters, how do you do it as a GM?
I will let you know in advance that it's almost never in my notes because I have really terrible GM notes. Almost always, I have really awful GM notes. So I will let you know it's almost never in my notes. It's almost always in relationship with the players at the table, and sort of trying to get a sense of where are the queer peoples in the environment that they're exploring and experiencing. And I really like Avery's discussion of the slider. Is you can really pull in some of those sort of media archetypes for queer people, but you can also play with some of those media archetypes for queer people. Let them undermine some of those expectations for whether it's for a comic or dramatic thing. I think it's important to me personally, and I'd love to get more perspectives on this, but it's been important to me personally that queer people don't only exist as innocent people that the heroes are protecting, that queer people exist in the full complexity of the world, that they're villains, that they're co-heroes, that they are the subjects of other narratives, as well as being the guy down the street selling them coffee, or the woman who runs the bookstore. that that queer people exist in all those environments. That sometimes they're fighting the queer villain, that sometimes they will meet the queer soldier in the enemy army. But all those, all the parts of the world that the PCs are interacting with have representatives of queer peoples in them, and have examples of queerness in them.
If it's okay to jump in and kind of build off of that, I think that historically, queer people have always been represented in stories as villains. There's a specific thing called queer coding, where you make your character, like your villain's character, stylish and squishy and kind of over affected and over self-indulgent, and they stare at mirrors to like twirl their mustache or like adjust their coifs like slightly too often, and that character is implicitly queer coded. Like every Disney villain. And most of the Disney villains are like explicitly modeled after specific real world queer people, like how Ursula is modeled after Divine, the drag queen.
Yeah.
And then there's been a shift to also include queer representation in like the form of like the angelic tragedy character. The like never really deserved this, beautiful, fair-skinned, 17-year-old usually, who was too short for this world and got beaten to death. And we've had a few decades of that character, and straight people playing that character and winning Academy Awards. And I think that a push for queer representation needs to be a push for queer characters who are flawed and like messy, and who do things that make them kind of unlikable in the way that everybody in the world does things that make them kind of unlikable. To have queer characters that are three-dimensional, which just like inevitably includes having them be like messy and obnoxious some of the time. And to get past this place of like stylish queer villain or like tragic angel, like to find the middle ground.
Yeah, just as a personal note, I am full on sick of both of those tropes. Maybe that's where I am in my journey right now, or maybe that's just I reached saturation.
Hi listeners, I wanted to let you know we have just kicked off Volume 3 of the Codex RPG zine. Can you believe it? The first issue in Volume 3 is Codex Flame. Here's what you'll find inside. Fire Ships at Midnight, a 3-player game that tells the story of the failed invasion of England by the Spanish Armada in 1588. A Handful of Ashes, a LARP about grieving and letting go. Like Matches to Paper Dolls, a play-by-mail game about love, longing, and missed connections. The Miscellany, 36 Separated Lovers. 5 original illustrations, and a custom layout by our new layout artist, Jake Householder. You can get Codex Flame by making a $4 or higher pledge at the Gauntlet Patreon, which is at patreon.com/gauntlet. And a quick reminder, we are currently running a Kickstarter campaign for the Codex Volume 1 hardcover book. That campaign ends on October 28th. Thanks.
Something that we don't often speak about a lot in the LGBTQ stuff is that is part of that whole plus dimension for asexuality. I know for me that I don't have this come up a lot in games because it seems like nobody wants to touch the topic of sexuality in their games. As I mentioned before, it's like, what's your character like at home? I don't know. So have any suggestions about how to bring asexual and asexuality themes into a game?
I think that one of the challenges that makes it difficult to incorporate asexual content and representation and kind of story and themes into role-playing games is that most role-playing games are like aggressively non-sexual, or if there is sexuality in it, it's like because it's a fantasy adventure game and you can like win the romance of the bar wench, or you can win the romance of the princess. Like it becomes another form of treasure getting. But aside from that small specific trope, a lot of role-playing games are very, 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 very hesitant to talk about relationshiping or talk about sex or talk about sexuality or talk about how the characters are sexual beings just like as part of who they are, which then makes it sometimes hard to figure out how to talk about asexuality meaningfully within that storytelling medium, because talking about like the absence of a thing which is already absent in the stories. As far as with Monster Hearts, which is a game that's explicitly about relationships and sexuality and hooking up, the second edition of the game includes rules about asexuality. And I went through a couple iterations of drafting the rules and then sharing them with asexual friends, and then having them be like, "This is awful. This is worse than nothing. Please do not publish this." And it took me a little while to get what asexuality was doing in stories. That it's not about how you don't do X or you don't experience X, but rather I think the way to incorporate asexuality into storytelling is to talk about you experience X because the pressures that other people put on you don't make sense for you. Like that is the positive additive drama that you can introduce into a story that is about asexuality. So like people, like you're trying to negotiate, we're in a fantasy adventure game, you're trying to negotiate with the guard to let you through, and the guard is suddenly getting weird and giving you weird signals you half understand, and you kind of piece together that what's happening is the guard is like coming on to you. And like how do you deal with trying to have this like very simple, like I will bribe you with gold and then you will let me through so I can kill your king, and then this guard is like coming out of left field with a thing that doesn't entirely make sense to you and that you have no practice at. What do you do next? So I think that
excellent advice.
That is what you do.
Anything to expand from that, Richard?
Actually, I was going to ask Avery anyway, because I knew that that I have had very little experience sort of bringing having to kind of encourage my group that does not currently include a lot of people who identify as asexual into kind of bring the fullness of their characters' backstories in. I had not really had a lot of experience letting them talk about asexuality. It's like Avery said, that it frequently was more that the whole adventure world was sort of operating at a very asexual level. So I thought like talking about asexuality is not an absence of something, but as a different way of experiencing human interaction was very enlightening. So thank you.
All right. What guidance and cautions do you have to offer cis people about playing trans characters? There are definitely a lot of pitfalls here. I can definitely say that maybe you don't want to do that if you're going to do like a pocket-sized player or something like that. I don't know. That seems to be a very sensitive issue right now of having specifically men playing trans women. I have intense feels about a particular show that I won't get into right now because of that. Either of you want to jump on this one first?
Yeah, I can do it. There was an article or like a short Tumblr post that had been screen capped that was shared that I saw a few months ago, explaining a little bit about like hey, cis people, here's maybe a way to help you get closer to understanding what being trans would be like. And so, for example, if you're a cis man, rather than trying to imagine that you, in your heart of hearts, know that you are a woman and that you have to like take steps forward to realizing that in some way, rather than going through that route to try and imagine and get into the space of imagining and embodying like a trans character. Instead, start from the place of, okay, so you're a man. Imagine for your whole life, everyone was telling you that you weren't. Imagine that you are exactly the person you are right now, and your entire life, people have told you that you are a girl. Imagine how that would change your experience of doing your everyday things and going about your everyday life. And so I think that's maybe a place to start in terms of playing trans characters, is that you've lived your whole life as a man, you were assigned male at birth, you identify as a man. Try playing a trans man. Try playing someone who has the exact same gender identity that you do and way of understanding how gender operates in the world and constructs the world that you do. And imagine that people consistently denied the existence of or correctness of the masculinity that you have in your character.
Anything to add to that, Richard?
I thanks, Avery, because my big cautions were thinking about steering clear of the really problematic stereotypes, the drag king, drag queen stereotype, but also the angel stereotype that Avery had discussed, is really kind of steering clear of those two things and finding ways to let the character be complex, be flawed, but also be proactive and an active part of the narrative and of the world.
All right. So we're going to roll directly from that into the fact that LGBTQ themes are all ages. So what are some all ages queer content that really stand out to you? I'm not going to say the obvious one that probably everyone is thinking. I did recently hear about a book that's called The Boy in the Bindi that is written by a non-binary person, semi-autobiographical about asking their mother about the bindi, and it is super adorable. And
yeah, that's by Vivek Shreya, who is also a poet and musician, and probably like graphic illustrator as well, and performer. And all of her work is just like super amazing. The Boy in the Bindi is like a really good early storybook kind of thing.
Right.
Is the one that you were thinking of the one on everyone's mind? Is that Steven Universe?
Of course. Yeah, somebody explained Steven Universe is gay space rocks, and that's basically how it is. I mean, there's a lot of not just queer themes. You have a species where everyone is feminine identified, even though gender doesn't actually make any sense in gem society because they're all manufactured, not born. Spoiler alert. Sorry, everyone. And yeah, how they navigate, attraction and romance and things like that is very, very excellent. It's not without its problems because nothing is without its problems. But yeah. Any other ones?
Okay, well, rather than going to other ones, is it okay if I just talk about Steven Universe for a second? Because I think that it does more than just showing like, and here's some queer grown-ups that are in a story that is children accessible. I think that one of the things that Steven Universe really does well is that it does literal depictions of queer characters, but it also, through metaphor, explores other aspects of queer experience. Like, I think that one of the really beautiful things about the show is that it shows soft and tender and healing-oriented masculinities. It shows the power and tenacity and creative vibrancy of women's relationships in women's spaces, but it also shows how jealousy and bitter romantic rivalry and complicated unrequited love that never fully gets realized or expressed but continues on throughout, in this case, centuries or millennia, how that is just inherently part of queer women's spaces. And I think that it does a lot of that in a way that's not just like, and these characters are gay and this is a gay experience. It also does that in and here's what it's like to be an enclave of the only 3 gems in the world raising a kid together, right? Like it does it through metaphor, and it does it in a sideways way where I feel like some of the episodes have left me crying, and I wasn't sure why until 2 weeks later when I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I see what they were doing there now all of a sudden. And I think that that is a really powerful way to introduce queer themes in all ages spaces, or queer themes that aren't in like R-rated stories, is to look at what the experience of being in queer community means, and what the experience of being in queer like family networks means, and figuring out how to tell those stories either through metaphor or through like the constellations of characters that are existing around the player characters.
In Steven Universe, and something that someone who had tried to get for this panel but they couldn't make it pointed out, is that by being inclusive, you also have to be exclusive. To be inclusive of people with non-mainstream sexualities and who are trans and everything like that, you have to exclude people who are going to be jerks about it. And if you look at a lot of fiction that includes queer characters and those spaces, the Gems, for instance, are very, very protective of Steven and who he associates with and everything like that, because the world, not just Gems stuff, but actual humans can be very damaging as well. Richard?
I didn't have any media to add because I kind of live in I mostly, outside of my gaming circles, I live in an all adults world. I don't have kids of my own, and don't have close friends who have kids who are nearby. So I did want to kind of chime in and say, I think living in an urban setting, I think one of the important things that Avery had pointed out is that you're really bringing in the fact that that all characters live in networks that include gay people, that have gay families, and living in the setting I do right now, it's been very illuminating coming from super conservative suburban Texas to have children really be teaching me about what their life is like inside gay communities and gay social networks, gay families, even from a very young age, being very informed and being very part of their parents' lives and their parents' networks. So letting children really bring that to the table and creating safe space for that to happen has been a really big part of having kind of all ages organized play that has queer experiences and queer characters.
To sort of extend on what Richard said, that is one of the easier ways to talk about LGBTQ themes with kids around and in games with kids, is that there are, in the worlds where there's kids and kids games, there are always adults. There's always, you don't have to do like the Peanuts thing where the adults all, talk from off screen and whose voices are voiced by trombones. You can have people's parents and aunts and uncles and cousins and all that sort of thing show up, and friends of the family and so on and so forth. There's nothing that's really inherently risky or weird about that. Avery, did you want to add anything to that? Since you actually you said you have kids and you network with people that also have kids. Most of my friends are childless, so I don't really have any experience there.
Yeah, I think that one thing to think about is that queer themes don't exist in a vacuum. Queer themes, or like queer experiences and queer lives intersect with so many other experiences and so many other facets of being alive. Queer people are statistically more likely to be mentally ill, more likely to be impoverished, more likely to be incarcerated, more likely to experience police repression or police violence, more likely to have tenuous relationships with something like a parent advisory committee or a neighborhood strata. They are more likely to have friends in crisis, whether that's financial, emotional, mental health oriented, or any other kind of crisis. They are more likely to be involved in on-the-ground activism, which means they're more likely to be dealing with kind of like just like a whole host of things. And the fact that those statistics exist and that those things are interlinked and that those things form part of what it means to be in a queer community means that they are also all queer themes. And so in terms of like what it means to tell all ages queer stories is it means to think about queerness as more than just what kind of underwear you put on and who you fuck. It also means like how your family structure is weird, how experiences of depression, ennui, or trauma pervade every attempt at community organizing you make. It means a whole host of things, and I don't mean to just get into the gloom and doom and despair of it. It also means like what kinds of brilliant utopic possibility are you eking out in the city that you live in? It means all those kinds of things. It means like what it like, for example, in Steven Universe, like the first queer thing that's going on in that, like, you don't need to wait until there's like explicitly dykey relationships going on. Like the very first episode, you see a tender, soft-hearted boy being raised by a community of women and looking up to them and seeing their strength. Like that's already queer. That's already super, super queer. Like you don't need to have them, the women in that series be sleeping with each other for it to like somehow become queer, right?
Yep.
It already is, because queer themes intersect with a lot of other themes.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, in your, I guess to sum up, if you're going to have, kids, making sure that ghosts and malicious animal spirits aren't like infiltrating their lives, that's apparently a really common theme, is having like kids in ghost stories and ghost mysteries. Like you can have other adventures and other themes come in that's just, messiness of the real world and how kids have to deal with that, like, so yeah. Do we have anything else we want to do with this topic before we move on? We are just a smidge behind. All right. So the next one is designing in queer games, which after this is done, we will I can reshare Avery's talk from several years ago, if that's cool with you, Avery, which is very good, albeit a little noisy because it's in a convention center, but she covers a lot of queer design themes in there and how to work around that stuff. So yeah, homework for all of you listeners. So when you're designing queer games, how do you design games that invite a wider audience to play characters and explore queer themes? Like, some straight folk are really leery about doing that, and others are like our wonderful help desk organizer, Christo, who played a very sexual man in a room full of probably straight guys and spent the entire time being, sten fatale, and it was amazing, and everybody got into it. Everybody was having an excellent time in exploring those themes. But yeah, how do you do that without like a rainmaker like that?
Okay, I will jump in. I think that the closest analog that I have to playing queer content for people who aren't versed in and steeped in queer community, like I feel like an insider on that kind of needing knowledge to play the game. But a place where I feel like really an outsider is historical gaming. I often feel like I'm sitting down to a table and everyone else knows just like so much more, and there's a whole lexicon that they have access to, and I'm like, is this written down? Like, where are you? Did you just memorize all of this? You just know the models of every plane, and you know the dates of every battle, and like how? But I think good historical game design, and I'm especially thinking of like Jason Morningstar's games right now. I think he does a tremendously good job of this. The things that I see there is evocative, storytelling oriented setting detail. There are little details of setting that it's easy to just kind of like grab and insert into the game. And there's explicit permission to get it wrong, and to be like, like here's the trove of little bits of historical detail for you to work with. here's the evocative, immersive overview of what the setting is generally like, and here's permission to get it wrong because we're playing a game, and the point of playing the game is to have fun. And I think that in terms of like how to present queer gaming that invites straight people to the table, I think it's like the exact same thing. Like evocative storytelling that helps people get into the mindset of like, what is this narrative about? Specific concrete details of like place names and identity terms and other things like that that they can pluck and insert, and also permission to just like get it wrong and make it your own. So like, for example, if you're playing a queer game set in San Francisco in the early 90s, talking like, having a paragraph of flavor text about like, this is what San Francisco feels like. It's always cold, and it doesn't make sense because just across the bay is a place that's always warm, but it's just always cold and foggy. And here are the realities of AIDS at that time in the gay man's community. And then here's a list of things like, just like saying the Castro district and things like that, like things that a straight person can just grab a name off the list and say it, and it'll feel more real. And like, they're really part of this story about like a gay man's community in San Francisco in the early 90s.
Yeah. And this is, something to include, like, as stereotypical as it sounds, there are gayborhoods even today, even in our relatively eclectic, Western societies. So yeah, just like you will have, Chinese neighborhoods and Hispanic neighborhoods and so on and so forth, you do have queer neighborhoods, and though our lives influence that geography, and that geography influences our lives. Richard, anything else to add?
It strikes me, kind of building off what Avery said, is that one of the things that is powerful about queer community and queer culture is that we're constantly bringing people of all ages in as new members. We may be shifting away from that as more and more people come out at younger and younger ages. But certainly for me, I came out in my mid-20s. I knew lots of people who came out in their 30s, possibly even their 40s. And I think that we're constantly introducing people to the culture and history that we have, and that they're actually inheritors of and part of. And I think we can bring some of that mentality into games as we think about ways to introduce people to queer experience and queer characters, to think about that sort of cultural acclimation process that people go to through the coming out process, and that sometimes it has lots of space to get differing perspectives. And you certainly can be out for a long time and still have a lot to learn about gay culture, gay history, and gay identity. And I think that's probably true of larger queer cultures as well. And I think that when you can help possibly even gamify that sort of coming out, learning, becoming part of a culture process, that can help bring people in. And I think a point of reference there is it's certainly somewhat like the process of becoming a fan of something. You discover that you care for something, you're passionate about something, you love something, but becoming a fan in many ways involves becoming part of a community of people. And I think if we can find ways to make that part of character building or character creation, it can become easier for people to come in, because as they're not going to know everything if they're baby gay people or baby lesbians, newly discovering their gender identity. And I've been out for 20 something years, and I still feel like a baby gay guy sometimes. I feel like, oh my gosh, there's this whole life that I'm barely aware of, or there's this whole, aspect to a community that I'm barely aware of. So I think that playing with that sort of cultural acclimation process and the kind of growth that comes with that. Also, the kind of anxiety that comes with that. We're very afraid of, or at least my experience as a gay man was coming out, becoming part of a gay culture, but still having very toxic masculine ideas about who I was, and having to sort of let go of that anxiety that I would suddenly magically turn into someone who was too gay, whatever that meant. And that, all of a sudden my straight friends who'd been so super supportive would stop being supportive magically if I went too far. And I think there's lots of that cultural acclimation, and becoming part of a community process, that really invites people to be new and to discover things and to learn.
Yeah, and I think that a small amount of time to do this, but this of course, queer representation isn't an end goal. It's part of the process of introducing and establishing gay culture and our history and everything like that. Because very, very infrequently do you have, anymore anyway, a single gay person or a single trans person living in a vacuum where we don't know other people with similar experiences. Any other little tidbits that we want to add to that? About how there's more axes of than just representation?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in if that's okay. I think that representing queer people in stories is an awesome and amazing goal, and it's super important. And there's so many stories about someone seeing a character in media and it just changing their life, right? Being like, this is the first Black lesbian I ever saw on TV, and it made my own personal journey, my own personal life possible. And I think that's great. And I also think that when we talk about media and talk about queering media, we often get super stuck on representation as the only piece of that we're able to kind of envision and start actualizing. And I think that two others that come to mind as being super important. One is creatorship. I don't think we create queer television or queer games by just having straight people author in some queer characters, especially because they are authoring them in based on their presumptions of what queer characters are actually like. And that's the thing that is super painful to watch in portrayals of trans women. They're often written by people who don't actually have any trans women in their life. And so they're just regurgitations of past media stereotypes about what a trans woman is. And so you just kind of have this facsimile of a facsimile of a facsimile of a facsimile of a theoretical person. And it doesn't actually bear any resemblance to queer lives.
It's like homeopathic queerness at that point. It's been diluted so that there's not a single molecule of it left in the tincture.
Exactly. But not only that, I think queer creators are just economically disadvantaged statistically. Queer people in general are likely to make less money. They're likely to have less generational access to wealth. And so I think a goal for queer in games means having actual queer people get paid actual money. To have actual queer people have director credits, producer credits, actor credits, writer credits, illustrator credits. If queer in games and queer representation can't happen without putting actual money into queer people's actual pockets. I think that's a part of it. And I think another part of it is with games. Games are different than comic books, and the way that they are different is that they are interactive and systems oriented. And so the systems and the rules and the structures that we make for games, we need to ask, how can these be queer? How have these always already been implicitly heteronormative structures? And there's a lot of examples. Adventure games are often about people who have a clear advancement ladder in their society and in their role as an adventurer, and they can acquire and accumulate wealth and esteem in the eyes of their community. And looking at how is that a heteronormative structure? How is that something that that doesn't actually make sense for telling stories about lesbians who have magic powers or like fags who have swords, right? Like it doesn't, it's not, it doesn't
It also
actually
doesn't
translate. And so
necessarily track for immigrant populations and things like that either, because you can't have generational wealth when the previous generations are on the other side of the planet. And yeah, in your YouTube video, you talk about how there isn't really a ladder for queer people. It's more of this, well, it's more like spaghetti. It's it's in and out and around and through, and yeah, there's no linear progression to be had.
And so I think that queering games doesn't just mean having queer characters or having queer creators. It also means looking at the structures that create our stories and ask, like, how can we challenge the like one-to-one player-to-character ownership and monogamy? How can we challenge the progress narrative? How can we challenge the idea of grand heroes and lesser bit characters? How can we challenge the privileged hero perspective? How can we challenge all of these things? And how do we design games that actually represent the kinds of stories that we find ourselves forced to live in our actual lives because the privileged hero progress narrative, wealth accumulation across generations and adventures story doesn't actually bear any truth for lived queer experience a lot of the time.
Richard, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think as Avery was talking, I was very much thinking about historical gaming and about the long absence of obvious queer people from historical play and historical gaming, just because it takes digging and imagination to find space for queer people in history. And I think that's one of the I think that's one of the places that I would really love to see a lot of what Avery was talking about. The challenges represented by queerness come out is in exploring, queer identities in history. So that as I've been playing a lot of historical games recently. So thank you.
All right. And now looks like we're right up on time, but I don't necessarily have a problem going a little over, especially since we started a couple minutes late. The question that stands out to me most from the panel channel is, how do you put everyone in the crosshairs, but also avoid burying your queer characters? It's one of the principles of Apocalypse of World, which is very popular among the Gauntlet. And it's, it can be very problematic if, you're introducing a whole bunch of characters, they're all queer, and they all die within a few, hours game time. So how do you balance those concerns? Richard, you unmuted first, so you're first in line.
I think it's a matter of thinking about what your stakes are. I mean, there's obviously some there's ways to keep people in your crosshairs without burying everybody, but to make sure that you don't single out your queer characters for aggressive action first. That unless your story is some sort of history of queer experience in the coming out process or building queer communities, that you're not necessarily making the putting in the crosshairs process more aggressive or more heterosexist or specifically homophobic and transphobic. That the crosshairs are for everyone, and they're also it's not solely about the character being the crosshairs are not solely motivated by homophobia and transphobia. That the people on the other end, the people with the spotters who are putting those in the crosshairs, are not just coming after them because they're gay. They're coming after them because of all the other things they bring to the fictional world.
And if you screw it up too, you can always X-card yourself. It's okay. If you introduce something that suddenly makes you uncomfortable as a GM, you can X-card yourself.
Right.
It's totally fine.
Right. And it's I think as even as queer people, it's sometimes tempting to let the crosshairs be all about homophobia and transphobia, that we're putting people in the crosshairs because they're queer. Like, you know, so we're going after the heroine's girlfriend because we're, you know, because the bad guys are homophobic. And looking for more complexity in why the heroine's girlfriend is in the crosshairs, and you're using that to bring her into action, to bring everyone into action, but also to look at the complexity of that relationship, the complexity of the world around them. I think helps avoid just bearing the gaze, and also, you know, making sure that you look for the crosshairs that are on all the other parts of those people's lives besides just their romantic relationships, that queer people are close to their families or have troubled relationships with their families, and that can make things interesting narratively when you put those families in the crosshairs, or when you put business relationships in the crosshairs, adoptive relationships in the crosshairs. And so, you know, you can avoid, I think, just bearing your gaze by thinking of your queer characters as having, for all the roles they participate in the world. So
okay, we're going to jump to Avery. There's apparently another panel that's happening right after this one, so we're gonna do this lightning round after this.
Okay, sounds good. This question makes me think about slasher movies. And in slasher movies, there is a really reliable formula of who dies in what order. It goes black guy, slut, stoner, blonde, football player, blonde, and then the brunette survives, like every single time. And so in terms of putting queer characters in the crosshairs, like, do it because your job is to put people in the crosshairs, but don't be making your own slasher formula of who suffers in what order and in what predictable way, because it sucks and it gets boring. I think that queer characters, like in the real world, are put in the crosshair a bit more often than straight characters or straight people. And so if you want to do that, that's great. Queer people in the real world are sometimes hurt, marginalized, or killed because of their queerness. And so if you want to include that some of the time as how consequences materialize in your world, that makes sense, and that's great storytelling. But if you do that every single time the reason that a queer character dies is because a bigot was killing them, that doesn't actually reflect, like what Richard was saying, reality, and it doesn't make for good storytelling. Some of the time, queer people are killed because they are queer. Some of the time, queer people are killed because they are poor and they don't have access to the medications that they need to survive. Sometimes queer people are killed because they were dealing drugs on someone else's turf, right? Like there are a lot of ways to put queer characters in the crosshairs, and they should be put in the crosshairs because of their queerness a bit of the time and not the rest of the time. That's my thoughts.
Buses hit queer folk and straight folk alike, you know. Death does just happen sometimes. So in 30 seconds or so, try to say, how do you encourage people to get out of the heterosexuality box? I know in my experiences, I'll just have people with the same gender flirt with their characters. I'll have, you know, I will bring up the topic because, you know, yeah. Richard?
I think it's not only a matter of this. I think I guess my slightly flip answer is get diverse people to your gaming tables, who have a diverse, like a lot of times I hear people like, you know, oh, I want to invite these people, but they make other people at my gaming table uncomfortable. And part of me just wants to go, then who cares about those other people? You know, these are people who need to be at your gaming table because they're going to push lots of different content that maybe you as a GM and other players have not imagined yet. You know, just opening up your table to get people in there, and to get GMs in there who bring other narratives in, even if they're just very marginal side narratives, even if they're just things kind of happening just off screen. Diversify the kind of stories you tell in really powerful, radical ways.
All right, Avery?
So I think that as a general rule of thumb, when you create a character that is imminently relatable to you in at least two ways, and in at least two ways quite a bit different from your life experience. Right? Draw from both what you do know and exploring what you don't know. Just do that whenever you create a character. Not just about queerness, but about every facet of life and lived experience, and goals. And again, I said this earlier, role-playing games are a great place to make mistakes. And the way you make a mistake really good is that you read the room when you say things, and when people look hurt or they're squinting at you a lot, ask about it if it seems like you need to, or otherwise just decipher that doesn't seem super plausible or relatable or on point to people, and work to grow and adapt. Right? Like, role-playing games are a great place to make mistakes and learning.
Yep. As everyone's favorite fictional teacher says, make mistakes, get messy. Apparently she's also one of us now, so that's awesome. Thank you, Avery.
She's always been one of us. Miss Frizzle has always been gay.
Yeah, she has. But thank you, Avery, for joining us on this panel. Thank you, Richard, for coming as well, and both of you for sharing your insights. That is going to wrap up the panel. We need to keep the conversation going because, it doesn't just exist in this 1 hour space. Bye, everybody.
Bye.